Ernst Kaltenbrunner was born on October 4, 1903, in Ried im Innkreis in northern Austria, at a time when the map still read Austro-Hungarian Empire. From the outset, his life seemed shaped by two forces that blended easily in that region: the prestige of a family of lawyers and a pan-German nationalist ideology that, in interwar Austria, was experienced both as identity and resentment. Later, that world would push him onto a path where the law was not a limit but a tool. In his youth, Kaltenbrunner was educated like many men of his social class, a demanding secondary education, student circles deeply marked by politics, and an atmosphere in which anti-Marxism, anti-clericalism, and the obsession with union with Germany were discussed as if they were natural matters. In Graz, he studied law at the university and graduated in the second half of the 1920s. This phase was not merely academic. It was a social laboratory in which a type of jurist was formed, one who did not wish to defend an existing order, but to prepare a new one. By the time he qualified and began practicing as a lawyer, Austria was already a country under permanent strain. The Great Depression, political violence, and radicalization had turned the streets into a battlefield of symbols. In this climate, joining the Austrian Nazi Party was not a fashionable choice, but a dangerous gamble. Kaltenbrunner entered that world in 1930 and the following year joined the SS, which in Austria was still a small, illegal structure dependent on clandestine networks. What set him apart was not brilliant oratory or a heroic biography. It was something else: discipline, toughness, organizational ability, and an almost mechanical willingness to carry out orders within a movement that operated in the shadows. Tall, with visible scars on his face, Kaltenbrunner projected a physical authority that fit the SS style: hierarchy, intimidation, obedience. This mattered especially when the party was banned and every contact could end in a prison cell. In the early 1930s, repression by the Austrian state against the Nazis was intermittent but real. Raids struck committees, underground printing presses, and discreet meetings. During this period, Kaltenbrunner moved in and out of the police radar, was arrested more than once, and learned a lesson that would stay with him. Power was not gained solely through ideas, but through control of information, loyalties, and internal punishments. His role lay between the political and the operational, keeping an illegal structure cohesive, preventing leaks, and ensuring that obedience was not open to debate. The year 1934 marked a turning point. Austria experienced the Nazi coup attempt and the assassination of Chancellor Dollfuss, and the regime responded with persecution. Kaltenbrunner was imprisoned in this context and would be jailed again in 1935 when he was sentenced to several months in prison for illegal political activity. For many, this could have been a deterrent. For him, it functioned as a credential of his temperament: to remain, to endure, and to continue organizing even as many chose to flee to Germany. Indeed, biographical sources and studies suggest that his decision to stay in Austria was not accidental. From Germany, Himmler saw in him a useful operative to strengthen the clandestine SS network in Austria. Illegality also forced him to refine his methods. Kaltenbrunner operated through a logic of messaging and liaison work: travel, contacts, reports, orders. He was not a romantic conspirator, he was an administrator of clandestinity. And within SS culture, such efficiency was rewarded. By 1935, he was already regarded as a leader of the SS in Austria, and his name was increasingly associated with ideological reliability and organizational discipline. Two qualities that, in that universe, meant he could be trusted equally with dirty tasks and with tedious ones. The great leap came in March 1938 with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the Reich. History suddenly aligned itself with the pan-German dream that had fueled so many Austrian militants. For Kaltenbrunner, the transition from clandestinity to power was immediate. In Seyss-Inquart's brief cabinet, he held the post of State Secretary for Public Security and almost simultaneously became the higher SS and police leader in Austria, the highest SS and police authority in the territory. He was no longer the lawyer who helped militants evade sentences. He was the man who coordinated the apparatus that pursued, arrested, and reorganized the country according to the logic of the new regime. From Vienna, Kaltenbrunner stood at the center of an expanding machinery: police, intelligence, coordination with German authorities, and an accelerated process of political alignment that left no room for neutrality. His authority was measured in directives, in files, in chains of command, and what had once been a clandestine movement was now the state. In this transition, Kaltenbrunner quickly gained rank within the SS, consolidating himself as a man who did not improvise. He administered, executed, and demanded the same level of obedience from others. With the outbreak of war, the Reich's repressive structure became even more centralized. In September 1939, Himmler created the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, to unite and formalize the link between the SS intelligence service, the SD, and the security police, including the Gestapo and the criminal police. The RSHA was not just another office. It was the nervous system of state terror, responsible for intelligence, persecution, counterinsurgency, and the coordination of repressive policies on a continental scale. During the first years of the war, Kaltenbrunner continued to accumulate power from Austria with a profile that from above appeared useful. He did not compete for personal brilliance, but for efficiency. This type of ascent is rarely spectacular, but it is the most dangerous, because in a regime of total control, the men who rise through management are the ones who sustain the continuity of the system when the charismatic figures disappear. Then, in 1942, a wound opened at the top of the security apparatus. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the RSHA, was attacked in Prague and died of his wounds shortly afterward, leaving a huge vacuum in Himmler's architecture. For months, the succession could not be resolved, and Himmler assumed the functions on an interim basis, as if the position were too sensitive to be filled quickly, since he needed someone who guaranteed not only competence, but total obedience. In that context, Kaltenbrunner's figure fit with precision. Austrian, tested in clandestinity, rewarded in power, hardened by internal repression, and trained in the logic of SS command. He was not the kind of man who debated moral or political strategies. He was the kind of man who turned an order into a procedure. At the end of January 1943, Kaltenbrunner was summoned to Berlin. There, the final leap materialized. On January 30th, he was appointed head of the RSHA, the center of the Third Reich's intelligence and security system, inheriting the position once held by Heydrich and beginning to administer, from the desk and through orders, a machinery designed to monitor, crush, and exterminate. His work as head of the RSHA. When Ernst Kaltenbrunner arrived in Berlin to assume command of the RSHA on January 30th, 1943, he did not enter just any office. He stepped into the center of the regime's nervous system, an apparatus designed to see, hear, record, and punish. The position was marked by two enormous shadows. On the one hand, Reinhard Heydrich, the architect who had shaped that machinery with bureaucratic precision and organized violence. On the other, Heinrich Himmler, the political owner of the SS empire, who had maintained control during the transition after Heydrich's death and remained the formal superior of the new chief. Kaltenbrunner did not arrive to invent a new structure, but to sustain a well-oiled machine at the worst possible moment. In 1943, Germany was no longer expanding. It was beginning to retreat. The air war was pounding cities. The Eastern Front had become a constant hemorrhage, and the regime feared what obsessed Hitler most: internal collapse, the breakdown of the home front, sabotage, rumor, and disloyalty. In this context, the new head of the RSHA had to become less a strategist and more an administrator of fear, responsible for keeping a system functioning that was supposed to continue producing control as the state itself began to crack. Within the RSHA, Kaltenbrunner inherited an uncomfortable reality. The key men were already in place and needed no introduction. Heinrich Müller controlled Amt IV, the Gestapo, the operational heart of the secret police, with experience, networks, and methods developed since before the war. Walter Schellenberg headed Amt VI, the SD's foreign intelligence branch, a space where information, contacts, propaganda, and influence operations converged. The real power of the RSHA was played out, to a large extent, in the coexistence or clash between these office chiefs and the new director who came from outside the Berlin inner circle. For that reason, Kaltenbrunner's daily work was not just signing papers. It was about imposing hierarchy within an organization where many felt untouchable. His advantage was twofold. First, he enjoyed Himmler's trust. He was not a charismatic rival, had no faction of his own in Berlin, and his record showed him to be an obedient executor. Second, his physical presence and temperament contributed to an intimidating style of command that, in the SS universe, functioned as political capital. Over time, internal correspondence and later testimonies would show that Himmler increasingly delegated matters of internal security to him, disengaging from tasks as his attention was divided among military fronts, inspections, and political maneuvers. RSHA documents reflect this routine of control: directives on interrogations, communications of repressive policy, guidelines on reprisals, authorizations and orders that flowed downward as procedures. At Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner would attempt to reduce all of this to an administrative appearance. He claimed he was a jurist, that his role was theoretical, and that many signatures were stamps applied by subordinates or even forgeries. That defense clashed with the evidence of his position. As head of the RSHA and of the SIPO/SD, his name was associated with the formal circuit through which decisions of the apparatus were approved, transmitted, and legitimized. His relationship with Müller was especially delicate. Some historians debate to what extent Kaltenbrunner truly commanded a Gestapo chief who knew every cog in the machine and had accumulated autonomy since Heydrich. At the beginning, Müller was the one who knew where the files were, which teams operated in which cities, and which offices had overlapping loyalties. But as the war progressed, the balance could shift for a simple reason: Himmler needed someone to sustain daily repression while he moved from crisis to crisis. And if Himmler trusted Kaltenbrunner more, Müller could remain indispensable, but he was no longer the sole axis. The head of the RSHA chaired meetings, set priorities, intervened when a case became political, and demanded results. At the same time, Schellenberg's Foreign Intelligence Service began to gain importance for desperate reasons. Whenever the Reich searched for exits, probed indirect contacts, explored fractures within the enemy bloc, or attempted to buy time, Amt 6 served as a channel for feelers and influence operations. Schellenberg, skilled at constructing a narrative, would later present himself as a relatively independent figure. Yet the formal structure remained clear. The head of the RSHA held supervisory and approval authority and, in practice, reviewed significant initiatives, especially when they involved political risks. The relationship between the two became a cold duel: functional dependence, personal distrust, and rivalries over access to Himmler, and above all, over room for maneuver in the final phase of the war. As the months passed, Kaltenbrunner was no longer merely administering offices. He was also accumulating real influence. Here emerges the phrase that defined him as a threat even to his own superiors. In an intelligence report reproducing contemporary testimonies, it is mentioned that when, in April 1945, Himmler was asked to receive Swedish delegates linked to the World Jewish Congress, he reportedly said to Schellenberg, "How am I supposed to do that with Kaltenbrunner nearby? I would then be completely at his mercy." The remark was not praise, but an admission of political fear. Schellenberg, for his part, described Kaltenbrunner as one of his most active and dangerous enemies. The internal turning point came in 1944 with the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler. The failed coup did not only unleash massive repression, it redefined who controlled truth within the regime. Kaltenbrunner was summoned to Hitler's headquarters and became involved in the investigation to identify those responsible, along with their networks and contacts. In those days, the RSHA turned into a hunting organ within the state itself, and its chief gained something few possessed: direct access to the Führer at a moment of absolute paranoia. That access even altered the normal chain of command through Himmler. In the final stage of the war, Kaltenbrunner could report directly to Hitler on progress, arrests, confessions, and interpretations of the internal enemy. He was not merely a bureaucrat, he was a filter. And a filter, in a collapsing totalitarian system, can be more powerful than a minister. Hours spent with Hitler meant proximity, and proximity meant influence over desperate decisions, purges, priorities, and messages. Even so, control had its limits. As the Reich disintegrated, the reach of the RSHA began to fracture for material reasons: broken communications, isolated cities, local authorities acting on their own, offices operating according to survival logic rather than perfect obedience. The apparatus remained fearsome, but it was no longer omnipresent. Even at the center, the pressure of bombings, staff shortages, the evacuation of files, and anxiety over the inevitable end transformed discipline into nervousness. In that scenario, Kaltenbrunner became trapped in the final contradiction of his position, directing the security machinery of a state that was fading away while he himself needed to find a personal way out. His power in Berlin grew in terms of decisions and access, but the ground beneath his feet crumbled week by week, and the head of the RSHA began preparing for a different kind of struggle, not for control, but for survival. The last days in the Alps. By January 1945, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was still sitting atop the RSHA, as if the collapse of the Reich were merely an administrative problem. The Eastern Front was falling apart. The West was no longer a wall but a broken door, and Berlin functioned with ministries stunned by bombings, evacuations, and messages that arrived late or not at all. Even so, the head of the RSHA continued issuing directives. Internal security, interrogations, transfers, surveillance orders, instructions to move files and personnel. The apparatus he commanded was losing reach, yet it did not stop trying to operate as if it could still control the country through folders and urgent phone calls. For the Allies, Kaltenbrunner remained a major target. He was not a decorative official. He was the man who had commanded the office that unified secret police and intelligence, and his capture was worth more than that of many field generals. In 1945, as rumors of last stands and clandestine organizations spread, the RSHA was seen as a source of plans, networks, and communications that could prolong the chaos. Within that logic, finding him became a priority objective. As the Soviet advance toward Berlin continued, Kaltenbrunner divided his time. He no longer remained fixed at the center of power. Instead, he moved between the capital and southern Germany, and then increasingly toward Austria. He was not alone. In those months, numerous figures of the regime sought the same geographic escape: mountains, narrow roads, villages where control could still be mistaken for loyalty. The idea hovering in the air was that of the Alpine Redoubt, the supposed Alpine stronghold where the Nazis would resist fanatically and from which they would even descend to sabotage the Allied occupation with werewolf tactics. The CIA would later reconstruct that in early May 1945, this possibility was not regarded as a myth by military intelligence. It was believed that SS leaders and troops could concentrate in an alpine area east and south of Salzburg with depots, bunkers, and the movement of cadres into the interior of that massif. That belief pushed entire units to comb areas of Austria. A key account from those days appears in a historical CIA report approved for release and dated September 22, 1993, The Last Days of Ernst Kaltenbrunner. It details the operation from the Hunters' side as part of counterintelligence corps teams attached to US forces in Austria, and describes how, while following leads on other fleeing officials, Kaltenbrunner's name began to surface as a big game, slipping through villages and mountain roads. The area that ultimately drew attention was the Salzkammergut, an alpine region of lakes and salt mines, where places such as Bad Ischl and Bad Aussee functioned as traditional refugees. In Alt Aussee, the scene was deceptive. A beautiful landscape, a holiday atmosphere, but a human web made up of former officials, technicians, bureaucrats on the run, and personal contacts who still protected the former head of Reich security. The CIA report details how an informant network was built there with the local resistance movement and highlights Johann Brandauer, assistant to the mayor, as a central collaborator in the search. The pursuit became more concrete when precise information emerged, for example that Kaltenbrunner had been in Strobel on May 3rd, presiding over a meeting with other high officials and with intelligence chiefs linked to the RSHA, such as Wilhelm Waneck and Wilhelm Höttl, as well as figures associated with special operations, such as Otto Skorzeny. In the same report, this fact became a bridge. If there was a meeting, there was a structure. If there was a structure, there were communications. And indeed, the CIA recounts that a transmitting station was detected at the Kerry Villa, operated by RSHA men, and that dismantling it cut off, without realizing it at the time, what had been a communications center of the supposed redoubt and a channel connecting Kaltenbrunner to the outside world. Meanwhile, Kaltenbrunner had already gone into hiding. By April, he had settled in the area of Alps, a remote and sufficiently protected place that allowed him to move between houses, hospitals and chalets with the help of loyal supporters. The same CIA document describes the social microcosm surrounding his flight: SS doctors, officers, acquaintances, and above all, 2 women who became relevant for an unexpected reason. On one side was Countess Gisela von Westarp, identified as his lover. On the other, Iris Scheidler, the wife of Arthur Scheidler, the deputy who accompanied him. These personal connections, which in times of power had formed a circle of privilege, became a vulnerability during the escape. On May 8, 1945, the German surrender arrived. Even so, in the mountains there remained fear that armed pockets, escape routes, or attempts at negotiation might still exist. The CIA report notes that even at this closing moment, Kaltenbrunner tried to sustain the idea that he could still offer something, whether clandestine networks, an intelligence apparatus reorganized as a rearguard structure, or useful contacts as bargaining chips vis-à-vis the West. The report reconstructs meetings, proposals, and the notion of a project to position himself as an advisor in a potential independent Austria supported by the Anglo-Americans. It even mentions Huttel's effort to open contact with Alan Dulles in Switzerland. In any case, it was a plan that was running out of time. By then, the Manhunt already had a name and a method. The US unit searching for him in the area included CIC personnel and infantry support. In a historical summary by the US Army Intelligence Center of Excellence, the capture is described as the primary objective of the 85th CIC detachment in Austria, under the leadership of Robert E. Mattison, with interpreter Sidney Bruskin and Austrian guides familiar with the terrain. The final lead came on the morning of May 11th. Brandauer reported that a forest ranger and member of the resistance movement had seen Kaltenbrunner, Scheidler, and 2 SS guards 5 days earlier in a cabin called Wildensee Hütte, high in the Tozgebirge Massif. The information was not recent, but it came from a reliable source, and in the logic of an alpine escape it meant something crucial. Hiding places did not change quickly when the terrain consisted of snow, rock, and narrow paths. That night the patrol was assembled with an almost theatrical plan. They set out close to midnight to take advantage of the hardness of the snow, marched for hours, and struggled up covered trails and passes. The CIA describes the ascent with details of obstacles and falls, of heavily burdened soldiers lacking proper equipment, and of the pressure to arrive before full daylight. Around 5 in the morning they spotted the cabin. Shutters closed, no smoke, apparent silence. The contact was tense. They knocked on the door but received no answer. Then a shutter opened and a man appeared who was not Kaltenbrunner. He was handed a note written by Gisela von Westarp, urging him to surrender to the Americans to avoid falling into Soviet hands. The man denied that anyone else was present, but upon seeing guides advancing with rifles and troop movements, he barricaded himself inside. The cabin was completely surrounded. After minutes of calls and threats to break down the door, 4 men emerged with their hands raised. Inside, they found weapons and ammunition, as well as items revealing the occupant's identity and rank, a family photograph, documents, credentials, and metal insignia. During the first interrogation, Kaltenbrunner tried to maintain a facade. He carried false papers in the name of a discharged doctor and a medical kit to support the story, and he refused to admit who he was, despite the fact that, as the report itself stated, there was no way to mistake him. In any case, once they were taken down to the village, all attempts at deception ended. Around 11:30, already in Alps, a crowd gathered on the main street. At that moment, Iris and Gisela broke through the crowd, ran toward the detainees and embraced their men, forcing them to abandon the pretense in front of everyone. Nuremberg, the case against Kaltenbrunner. When Ernst Kaltenbrunner arrived in Nuremberg in late 1945, he was not simply another defendant. In the corridor connecting the prison to the courtroom, his figure stood out for both physical and political reasons. He was enormous, hard-faced, with a dueling scar running across his cheek. An American guard who watched him for months would later recall him as a big man around 2 meters tall, nicknamed Scarface, and at the same time as someone who, far from the cold pose of the SS official, frequently broke down in private, often enough to surprise even his custodians. But the real weight of his presence was not his height, but his position. Kaltenbrunner had headed the RSHA, which made him the highest-ranking SS officer sitting in the dock, the man who, in the final years of the war, had signed and transmitted orders from the pinnacle of the secret police. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum itself describes him as a key figure in the final solution in the conflict's last years. In Nuremberg, that description was not historical background, it was the core of the prosecution. From the very first interrogations, Kaltenbrunner seemed to understand that his only option was to separate his name from the machinery he officially commanded. His strategy was precise: to deny operational responsibility, to present himself as a distant administrator, and to shift the real burden in two opposite directions. Upward, he suggested that everything came from Himmler, from Hitler, from a system that surpassed him. Downward, he pointed to his subordinates, especially those who controlled the daily functioning of terror: the Gestapo, the intelligence departments, the regional chiefs. His version was that he did not carry out anything, that the RSHA was already a fully built monster when he arrived, and that his presence at the top did not amount to effective control. The problem was that the case against him was built with precisely the kind of evidence Nuremberg had chosen to privilege: documents, signatures, seals, directives, and sworn statements from figures within the apparatus itself. The trial record contains elements pointing to his direct influence, for example, a sworn affidavit by Walter Schellenberg, head of the RSHA's Foreign Intelligence, who described orders and remarks attributed to Kaltenbrunner in 1944. That document included everything from the idea of shooting sick female prisoners to guidelines not to pursue revenge actions against captured Allied airmen, as well as references to his visit to Mauthausen and observations on the scope of his authority. Such pieces destroyed Kaltenbrunner's most frequently repeated defense: I didn't know, I didn't control, I signed without reading. And even when he tried to turn the act of signing into something automatic, the tribunal confronted him with the basic logic of hierarchy. If the RSHA was the nervous center of the Gestapo, Kripo, and SD, and he was its chief, then his responsibility could not be reduced to a decorative role. The verdict of the International Military Tribunal made this clear. He was found guilty on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. There was, moreover, a detail that made his case particularly uncomfortable within the overall group of defendants. Kaltenbrunner was not merely a desk-bound bureaucrat. During the trial, evidence emerged of visits, conversations, and decisions in which his physical presence mattered. Part of the debate revolved around how much real authority he exercised over men such as Heinrich Müller, but the tribunal did not need to resolve every internal dispute in order to establish responsibility. It was sufficient to demonstrate that under his leadership, the RSHA continued to coordinate persecutions, deportations, killings, and so-called security measures that in practice amounted to policies of extermination and mass repression. Even his medical condition, which kept him away during the early stages of the trial, did not alter the course of the proceedings. Reports on his health indicated serious episodes requiring recovery and medical evaluation, but when he returned to court, his defensive strategy remained intact. He insisted that his signature was automatic, that decrees were processed without his actually reading them, and that concrete responsibility lay with others. That insistence, however, ultimately worked against him. It did not portray him as innocent, but rather as the kind of leader who accepted immense power without taking responsibility for what that power produced. On September 30th and October 1st, 1946, the tribunal read out the sentences. Kaltenbrunner was sentenced to death. The list published by the Nuremberg Memorial itself places him among those condemned to death by hanging and confirms the execution in the early hours of October 16, 1946, in the prison gymnasium. After the executions, there were no graves. The bodies were transferred to Munich and cremated at the Ostfriedhof crematorium. The ashes were scattered in a tributary of the Isar River to prevent any remains from becoming a symbol or a place of pilgrimage.